On June 28, 2016, two men walk into a government building in Beijing. One is Amhari Effendi Nazaruddin, special officer to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. The other is a fugitive. Zhou Lo holds no government position. He is wanted for the theft of $4.5 billion from Malaysia's Sovereign Development Fund. Yet, here he is, sitting across from Xiao King, the chairman of SASAC, the agency that controls every major state-owned enterprise in China. No press release follows. No diplomatic channel acknowledges the meeting happened. But minutes exist. Handwritten notes, seized 2 years later by Malaysian federal agents after a change of government, describe what was discussed in that room. The conversation was not about justice. It was not about recovering stolen money. It was about how to make the theft disappear and what China would receive in return. The proposal was this: China would finance massive infrastructure projects in Malaysia through its Belt and Road Initiative. The contracts would be inflated, doubled in some cases, and the excess billions would be quietly channeled to cover the debts of 1MDB, the fund Zhou Lo had looted. In exchange, Malaysia would award those contracts exclusively to Chinese state firms. Beijing would use its diplomatic influence to pressure the United States and other nations into halting their investigations into 1MDB entirely. A country's stolen future, laundered through railways and pipelines. A superpower's ambition, purchased with complicity. That meeting in Beijing was not an anomaly. It was a transaction. And transactions like it, infrastructure for influence, debt for dependence, concrete for control, have been repeated across 75 nations on 4 continents. This is the story of how China built the most sophisticated system of geopolitical leverage the world has seen since the Marshall Plan. Except the Marshall Plan was designed to rebuild nations. This one was designed to own them. This is not a story about roads and railways. It is a story about what happens when a nation with $1 trillion to lend meets countries desperate enough to accept terms they cannot afford and cannot escape. We are going to follow the money from Beijing to Kuala Lumpur, to Colombo, to Nairobi, to Vientiane, to Djibouti. We are going to trace how infrastructure contracts become instruments of political capture, and how a single meeting in 2016 reveals the blueprint Beijing has deployed across the developing world. And we are going to sit with the consequences. Nations that borrowed to build are now spending their tax revenue to repay. Citizens who were promised modernity are now subsidizing debt. A superpower turned concrete into the most effective weapon of the 21st century. To understand what happened in that Beijing meeting room, you need to understand what Malaysia was facing in June 2016. The 1MDB scandal had become public. The Wall Street Journal had published documents showing that nearly $700 million from the fund had been deposited directly into Prime Minister Najib Razak's personal bank accounts. Swiss regulators had frozen assets. The FBI had opened what would become the largest kleptocracy investigation in American history. Singapore was dismantling bank accounts tied to the scheme. 6 countries were conducting parallel investigations. Najib's government was not merely embarrassed, it was mathematically cornered. The 1MDB fund carried approximately $12 billion in total debt. The fund was insolvent. Interest payments alone exceeded what the Malaysian government could service without visible budgetary distortion. If the investigations continued, if the full architecture of the theft became public, Najib would fall, and with him, every official who had enabled the fraud. Zhou Lo saw the geometry of the crisis. He had stolen the money. Now he would broker its concealment. The proposal he carried to Beijing was elegant in its cynicism. Malaysia needed infrastructure. China needed markets for its state construction firms and strategic footholds in Southeast Asia. Both needs could be satisfied if the numbers were large enough to hide what was really happening inside them. The East Coast Rail Link was the centerpiece. A railway connecting Malaysia's East Coast ports to Kuala Lumpur and beyond. A legitimate infrastructure project with genuine economic justification. Its original projected cost was approximately 30 billion Malaysian ringgit, roughly $8 billion. Under the terms discussed in Beijing, the project would be awarded to China Communications Construction Company at a price of 65.5 billion Malaysian ringgit, approximately $16 billion. The inflation was not a rounding error, it was 100%. The additional $8 billion, the money that existed only as markup, as engineered excess, would flow through subsidiaries and shell structures to service the debts of 1MDB. CCCC, the Chinese state contractor, privately agreed to channel approximately $7.5 billion back into companies controlled by Zhou Lo, which would then redirect the funds to cover the obligations of 1MDB. On July 18, 2016, 3 weeks after the initial meeting, a second meeting refined the mechanism. The minutes, later seized by Malaysian investigators, noted that direct debt assumption by CCCC would be very noticeable on the company's financial statements. The solution was indirect payments, structured to appear as legitimate subcontracting and consulting fees that would indirectly be used to repay the debt of 1MDB. On September 22nd, a third meeting with SASAC's vice chairman and the vice president of China's Export-Import Bank finalized the arrangements. Both sides agreed to proceed, even though, as the minutes recorded, the projects may not have strong project financials. Both sides also agreed to ensure that the Malaysian public would believe all initiatives are market-driven. The deception was mutual and deliberate. China was not being manipulated. China was participating. But the deal contained something beyond financial engineering. According to the Wall Street Journal investigation, Beijing also offered to use its diplomatic weight to influence the United States and other countries into dropping their 1MDB probes. China would spy on journalists investigating the fund. China would shield the investigation's most wanted target. The price of silence was $16 billion in contracts. The product was impunity. But Malaysia was not the only country that paid that price. It was not even the largest. The Malaysia deal was not China's first venture into strategic infrastructure lending. It was, however, the most nakedly transactional, the case where the mechanism was documented in minutes that investigators could read. In most other cases, the architecture is visible only through its consequences. The Belt and Road Initiative was announced by Xi Jinping in 2013. Its stated purpose was infrastructure connectivity, roads, railways, ports, and telecommunications linking China to the rest of the world. Over the following decade, Beijing would disperse more than $1 trillion in loans to more than 150 countries. Chinese officials compared it to the Marshall Plan, America's post-war reconstruction of Europe. The comparison was apt, but not in the way Beijing intended. The Marshall Plan dispersed roughly $170 billion in today's terms. Belt and Road dispersed 6 times that. The Marshall Plan rebuilt nations devastated by war. Belt and Road built infrastructure in nations that often had no capacity to evaluate whether they needed it could afford it or could maintain it. The lending terms were the architecture's foundation. Unlike Western development loans, which typically carried interest rates below 2% and repayment periods of 30 to 40 years, Chinese loans often carried rates between 2 and 6% with repayment periods of 15 to 20 years. The difference sounds modest in percentage points. Over the life of a multi-billion-dollar project, it means hundreds of millions of dollars in additional cost. And the contracts contained provisions that Western development lending had abandoned decades earlier. Confidentiality clauses prevented borrowing nations from disclosing the terms of their own debt. Cross-default provisions allowed China to demand immediate full repayment if the borrower defaulted on any other obligation. The structure was designed to create dependency. A nation that borrows $5 billion at 4% with a 15-year term does not merely owe China money. It owes China votes at the United Nations. It owes China silence on Taiwan. It owes China access to strategic geography. The debt is not the product. The debt is the mechanism. The product is leverage. What that leverage looks like in practice depends on what the borrowing nation has to offer. By 2025, developing nations owe China at least $1.1 trillion in outstanding obligations. In 2025 alone, debt repayments to China from the world's poorest 75 nations total $22 billion. 8 countries, Djibouti, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, the Maldives, Mongolia, Montenegro, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, are classified by international assessments as being at high risk of debt distress, specifically due to Belt and Road loans. The pattern is consistent, the details vary, but the architecture is always the same. If Malaysia was the case where the mechanism was documented, Sri Lanka was the case where the mechanism was demonstrated. In 2007, Sri Lanka's president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, championed the construction of a deep water port at Hambantota on the country's southern coast. Hambantota was Rajapaksa's home district. It was also, by most economic assessments, an irrational location for a major port. Colombo, on the western coast, already handled the vast majority of Sri Lanka's shipping. Hambantota had no significant industrial hinterland, no established trade routes, no natural commercial demand. China's Export-Import Bank provided $1.5 billion in loans for the port's construction. China Harbor Engineering Company built it. The terms were not concessional. The interest rates were commercial, and the repayment schedule was aggressive. When the port opened, it operated at a fraction of its capacity. In its first years, it attracted more ships seeking emergency harbor than commercial vessels seeking trade. Sri Lanka's debt grew. Its foreign reserves shrank. By 2017, the government could no longer service the port's debt alongside its other obligations. The solution was a lease. In December 2017, Sri Lanka signed a 99-year concession granting China merchants, port holdings a 70% stake in Hambantota International Port. The lease was valued at $1.12 billion. Sri Lankan officials insisted the lease proceeds were not used to repay the Chinese loans that built the port, that the two financial arrangements were legally separate. The distinction, while technically accurate, captured nothing about the reality. A country had borrowed from China to build a port it did not need, could not fill, and could not afford, and had resolved the crisis by granting China a century of control over sovereign territory. In 2024, A Sri Lankan minister acknowledged that under the agreement's terms, China could extend the lease to 198 years. The port that was supposed to connect Sri Lanka to global commerce had instead connected China to the Indian Ocean permanently. Hold that number. 99 years. Extendable to 198. That is not a lease. That is a transfer with a return date no living person will see. Sri Lanka's broader debt crisis, which culminated in sovereign default in 2022, was not caused solely by Chinese lending. But China was Sri Lanka's single largest bilateral creditor. And the Hambantota port, the visible symbol of the debt relationship, now flies Chinese corporate flags on Sri Lankan soil. Laos is a country of 7.5 million people, with a gross domestic product smaller than the annual revenue of a mid-sized American corporation. Its economy depends on hydropower, agriculture, and remittances. It has no coastline. Its infrastructure, until recently, consisted largely of two-lane roads that flooded in the monsoon season. In 2016, construction began on the Laos-China Railway, a 422-kilometer high-speed rail link connecting Vientiane, the Lao capital, to Kunming in China's Yunnan province. The project cost $6 billion. China provided 70% of the financing. Laos borrowed the rest. $6 billion is not, by global infrastructure standards, an extraordinary sum. For Laos, it was approximately 1/3 of the country's entire gross domestic product. The railway opened in December 2021. Tunnels were bored through limestone mountains, bridges span river valleys, stations were built to international standards in a country where many roads remain unpaved. Chinese state media celebrated it as a symbol of shared development. The celebration did not mention the mathematics. Laos's public debt now exceeds 120% of gross domestic product. China holds approximately half of the country's external debt, over $5 billion. Debt service payments to China alone amount to roughly $700 million per year and will continue at that level through at least 2028. Total debt service in 2025, if fully paid, would consume approximately 90% of Laos's foreign exchange reserves. The currency, the kip, has lost more than 60% of its value since 2021. Inflation has surged. The International Monetary Fund classifies Laos as being in debt distress. The railway runs. The trains are modern. The stations are clean. The country that built them cannot afford to exist at its current debt level. Even under the most optimistic projections, Laos cannot escape its debt crisis without substantial relief from its largest creditor. That creditor is China. The same entity that financed the railway, built it, and profits from its operation now holds the key to whether Laos remains solvent. The railway was not a gift. It was not a loan. It was an acquisition of a nation's fiscal future, purchased with concrete and steel. 8,000 kilometers from Vientiane, on the Horn of Africa, sits Djibouti, a nation roughly the size of New Jersey, with a population under 1 million. Its economy produces almost nothing of global significance. Its territory contains almost nothing of natural value, except location. Djibouti sits at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. Approximately 12% of all global maritime trade passes through this strait every day. Neighboring Ethiopia, a nation of 120 million people with no coastline of its own, routes over 90% of its trade through Djibouti's ports. In 2017, China opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, less than 10 kilometers from the United States' only permanent military installation in Africa, Camp Le Minier. The base houses approximately 2,000 Chinese military personnel. China's engagement extends far beyond the base. Chinese firms built the Doralay multi-purpose port. Chinese loans financed the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway. Chinese investment helped double Djibouti's GDP from $2 billion in 2013 to $4 billion in 2023. The cost is between 57 and 70% of Djibouti's external debt owed to Chinese institutions. In 2022, Djibouti suspended debt repayments entirely after servicing costs tripled. The IMF classifies the country as being in debt distress. Consider the geometry. A nation that controls one of the world's most strategic waterways now owes the majority of its external debt to a single foreign power. That foreign power operates a military base on its soil, and that foreign power built the ports through which its neighbor's economy flows. That foreign power holds the mathematical key to whether Djibouti can service its obligations or must negotiate again from a position of total dependency. No shot was fired, no treaty was imposed, no territory was formally ceded. The word that applies is not conquest, the word is leverage. And the pattern does not stop at any one country's border. Step back from the individual cases, and the architecture becomes visible. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor consumed over $60 billion in planned investment. Pakistan's debt to China now represents more than 25% of its total public debt. The country required a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. In Kenya, the standard gauge railway cost $5 billion in Chinese loans. Kenya now spends over $1 billion per year servicing that debt. Kenya defaulted in 2022. In Montenegro, a European nation of 620,000 people, a Chinese-financed highway consumed approximately 25% of its GDP. The project remains unfinished. In Zambia, Chinese lending contributed to sovereign default in 2020. Ghana followed. The pattern is not universal. Not every Belt and Road project creates debt distress. Some have delivered genuine infrastructure. The debate over whether debt trap diplomacy is a deliberate strategy or an emergent consequence is real, and serious scholars disagree. But the pattern's existence is not debatable. 75 of the world's poorest nations collectively owe China $22 billion in repayments in 2025 alone. The countries caught in it share common characteristics: small economies, limited capacity to evaluate complex loan terms, political leaders who benefited personally from the construction boom, and populations never consulted about the borrowing that now defines their fiscal reality. The infrastructure is real. The railways run. The ports operate. But debt, unlike concrete, does not deteriorate with time. It compounds. And the country where this entire architecture was first exposed has not finished paying for it. Return to Malaysia. After Najib Razak's government fell in May 2018, the new administration under Mahathir Mohamad suspended the East Coast rail link. Investigators opened the sealed minutes from the 2016 Beijing meetings. The architecture of the deal, the inflated costs, the secret payments, the agreement to make everything appear market-driven, became public. Mahathir renegotiated. The East Coast Rail Link's cost was reduced from 65.5 billion ringgit to 44 billion ringgit, a cut of approximately $5 billion. China accepted the reduction. The project resumed. But the original damage had been done. The billions that had already flowed, the payments structured to cover one MDB's debts, the consulting fees that were not consulting, the subcontracts that built nothing, had already moved through the system. The money that was meant to build Malaysia's future had been consumed by the architecture of its concealment. In December 2025, a Malaysian court convicted Najib Razak on 4 counts of abuse of power and 21 charges of money laundering related to one MDB. He was sentenced to 15 years and fined 13.5 billion ringgit, approximately $3.3 billion, the largest financial penalty in Malaysian legal history. He remains in prison. Zhou Lo remains in Shanghai. Malaysia's 1 MDB debt will be serviced through 2039. The Belt and Road contracts that were designed to hide that debt created new obligations that will extend even further. Malaysian citizens, 33 million people, who had no role in the meetings in Beijing, no knowledge of the shell companies, no say in the inflation of a railway they were told would transform their economy, are paying for both. They are paying for the debt that was stolen, and they are paying for the debt that was manufactured to hide the theft. There is a phrase that appears repeatedly in China's Belt and Road communications: win-win cooperation. It appears in press releases, in speeches, in the preambles of loan agreements signed by nations that often lack the institutional capacity to evaluate what they are agreeing to. The phrase is not entirely wrong. There are wins. Laos has a railway it did not have before. Djibouti has ports that doubled its gross domestic product. Kenya has a train that connects its 2 largest cities. Sri Lanka has a deep water harbor that, after years of vacancy, now handles hundreds of thousands of vehicles per month. But the phrase obscures the mechanism. The wins are visible: steel and concrete, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, trains running on time. The costs are invisible, buried in repayment schedules, denominated in currencies that lose value against the dollar, structured with clauses that the borrowing nation's citizens will never read. A railway that costs 1/3 of a nation's gross domestic product is not a gift. A port leased for 99 years is not cooperation. A military base 10 kilometers from an American installation in a country that owes you the majority of its external debt is not partnership. It is architecture. The same kind of architecture that Zhou Lo understood when he walked into that Beijing meeting room in June 2016. The architecture of making dependence look like development, of making capture look like investment, of making a transaction so large and so visible that no one thinks to ask what is hidden inside it. The roads are real, the railways are real, the ports are real, the debt is also real. And every year, in 75 of the world's poorest nations, tax revenue that could build schools instead services loans. Revenue that could fund hospitals instead pays interest. Revenue that could create futures instead repays the past. The infrastructure will deteriorate. Concrete cracks, steel rusts. Railways require maintenance that indebted nations cannot afford. The debt will not deteriorate. It will compound. And in Beijing, behind the communications about shared prosperity and mutual benefit, the architects of the world's largest lending program understand what every creditor has always understood. The borrower serves the lender. not the other way around. If you came here to understand how power really works, not through armies, but through balance sheets, this channel has more stories like this one coming. Subscribe